So I'm going to ask at the outset, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm going to ask if anyone here if it's your first Sunday. Is there anyone here that's new? Okay, good. I don't see any hands, right? So what that'll do is that'll save me from saying, if any of you are new here to the sermon, which I periodically do. It's a small enough group, I figured I'd just get it out of the way. So if you have been here for a little while and heard me speak, you know that I normally dig into Scripture pretty hard. Today's going to be different. I'm really just going to be kind of jumping off of the text and then coming back to an end. But as I expressed in my prayer, today is really more of a confession of sorts. It's the ways that I've been ruminating over some of my idolatries over the past couple of years, and it's kind of been building and building and building. And so this sermon in this particular season comes out of that. So hear that if at times it sounds accusatory or anything. It's really, the you in the sermon is really more me. But hopefully some of you will find something in it that you can leave with. So I'm going to start in 1 Timothy 6 today. If you have your Bible, starting in verse 6. I'm going to grab my coffee while you turn there. So this is, in 1 Timothy, this is Paul's final admonition to Timothy. It's basically what he's closing off the letter with. He's just warned Timothy about false preachers who see godliness as a means of financial gain. Right? And then it starts out, verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves through with many griefs. I just want to make one comment kind of off the cuff. If you have an older Bible, you may read, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And a lot of modern translations have changed that for the love of money is a root. The debate there is because the Greek lacks the definite article that we would translate the. But that actually obscures it a little. Because in the Greek, the definite article doesn't always indicate the same thing it does in English. It's not the only way that you make things definite by putting the article there. And one of the interesting things in this passage is that the wording in the Greek, it starts out with root. That's at the front of the verse. Which indicates that Paul is certainly emphasizing this. He's emphasizing that a love of money is key to being the root of all kinds of evil. So whether or not it's the root or a root, understand that to some extent to soften this to a root is actually to miss the emphasis that Paul is putting on the problem of loving money. Just a side point. We'll kind of come back to that later. So we've been in a series on anxiety. If you've been here for a few weeks, it's going to be continuing through, basically right through Christmas. Now, I suspect that not everyone here has been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. But I think that probably most of us have experienced anxiety, and many of the symptoms that are actually associated with what psychologists call generalized anxiety disorder. Most of us have felt restless or on edge. I describe myself that way frequently. We've all experienced fatigue. I'm sure we've all had difficulty concentrating and had our minds go blank at different points. We all know what it is to be irritable, to have muscle tension, or to be really worried about something and have a hard time letting that worry go. Certainly we've all experienced problems sleeping one time or another. Now, if you've never been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or been close to someone who has, it may surprise you to learn that the things I just described are the very symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. Kind of surprised me when I found that out because I've experienced all of those symptoms together for not extensive periods, but certainly I would say yearly, there are periods where I experience all those things together, especially the feeling of being restless, being on edge, irritable. Now, of course, those who have the disorder experience these a disproportionate amount of the time. But I think those symptoms should show us that in today's culture, anxiety is a problem that everyone to some degree is afflicted with. It's not something that some have and others don't. Now, today I want to talk about one aspect of anxiety, what I think is one cause in our culture. Again, what I think has been one cause for me. I'm not addressing the situation of everyone, right? There's multiple causes of anxiety, and so I'm not saying, oh, if you have anxiety, this is why, and you just need to repent. That's not my purpose. Again, this is more of a confession. But before I say anything more about anxiety, I think I want to say something about God and about the ways that God has formed the fruit of the Spirit in me. As I sit back and reflect, there are, I think, certain practices that I participated in that have been formative in my life. And so I want to talk a little bit about these. So as I reflect upon my walk with God and consider how the fruits of His Spirit are evident in my life, here are the things that come to mind. Almost every morning, when I awake, one of the first things I do is open my phone to find what God has to say to me for the day. As I go about my day, I often find myself meditating on the things God wants me to pursue. In my daily relationships, frequently, conversations turn towards the good things God has given me. Almost every week, I go to a place of worship to be with others who are pursuing the things of God. And if I don't manage to get to a public place of worship, I participate in worship online. In fact, I think one of the most significant things that have formed my character in recent years is my almost daily participation in online worship. Right? To those who are kind of down on the internet, I don't think you recognize the very significant role it can play in forming us. Of course, certain times of the year serve to focus our attention on God. Today begins the season of Advent. Advent means, as Mike put it, the coming of our God. It's a time of year that we focus our attention on all the ways that our God blesses us. These practices, these times of corporate worship, these wonderful holidays. When I sit back and consider them, I must recognize that they've been some of the most significant means of my character formation. God has formed the fruit of His Spirit in me through these means. And what is the name of my God? What is His name? Consumerism. If you thought I was talking about another God, I'm afraid you've been misled. I was talking about the God of consumerism. And the fruit of His Spirit that I see so clearly in my life is anxiety. Since there seems to have been some confusion, I saw a few surprised faces, perhaps I should spell out more clearly how I have served the spirit of consumerism. You see, each morning I awake, and one of the first things I do is get on my phone. When I used to have social media accounts, I would immediately, though often unconsciously, take in the message of ads that filled the pages I was looking at. If you get this shirt, you'll be more fit, more beautiful. People will like you more. If you buy this book or subscribe to this magazine, you'll have the wisdom of the ages. My friends on social media were living testimony to consumerism's power at work in their lives, because there was a constant stream of new pictures showing how happy they were because of the new shirt, the new fitness program, the new trip they took. Since I don't have social media anymore, I'm limited to checking my email, but hundreds of emails I receive each week tell the same story. Consuming more things as a means of attaining happiness. Even if I don't immediately give up my tithe and offerings online, as I drive to work, I can't help but think of the ways that consumerism wants to bless me. I pass a Jeep dealer and am reminded of how amazing it would be to own a Jeep Gladiator. Right? That's the new Jeep truck. How much more manly can you get? Right? I would look like the man. Imagine the adventures I could go on with a Jeep Gladiator. right? I mean, I could have like a dirt bike in the back, I could drive up a mountain, drop out on my dirt bike, and the adventures would be endless. How happy I would be. I see the person running and am reminded of the fact that I need new running shoes. After all, my knees hurt when I run, and surely a new pair of running shoes would fix that. Speaking of shoes, I could probably use a couple new pairs of pants as well. I arrive at work and notice the sweet new tactical gear that one of my colleagues has. I ask him where he got it, and next thing you know, we're just sharing stories of all the good things that consumerism has done in our lives. If I don't get to the place of worship, each week I end up feeling dry and restless. So I try to make an effort to get to the mall, or Target, or some other place of worship each week. There I join others in simply marveling at all the great things that consumerism has brought us. I receive what I can, and because of his grace through credit, sometimes I'm able to receive even more than I deserve or have worked for. And I know that what I haven't yet received, consumerism will richly provide me with in the future. I leave the temple feeling happy and excited for what consumerism has done. But it doesn't take long for me to begin to feel dry again. And I know I need to return to the temple to receive my fill each week. If I can't get out to any of these places of worship, the internet has provided me with a means of worshiping at home. Arguably, there are even more options online, so I can receive exactly what I need for the day or week. The wonderful thing is, the testimony to the power of consumerism in my life is that I receive a sudden feeling of happiness, not only when I click the complete order button, but 2 days later when the fruit of my worship arrives in the mail. And then there's the wonderful season of Advent, right? The advent of our glorious God. Of course, the season really begins at Thanksgiving, where I take a brief but important moment to thank consumerism for all he has done for me. But then the real season of worship begins, right? On Black Friday, God humbles himself by offering his gifts at discounts that enable even the poorest in our society to afford them. Those of us who are more affluent will worship for hours. Just in case you are preoccupied with other less spiritual things on Black Friday, the churches provide a means of worshiping only a few days later with Cyber Monday. For the next 4 weeks after, we will continually meditate upon the glories of our God until the culmination of the great season, when we showcase his abundance by piling sacrifices under an altar of pine, where we will give and receive the grace of God together. Isn't my God wonderful? I'm thankful that I have all these means of worshiping at my disposal each day, because to be honest, I often find that when I purchase something, the joy that it gives me only lasts a short while. So I return to the temple and receive again. I must continually do this, or I find my joy fading. I find myself bored, discontented, and restless. Now this might worry me, except I recognize that the fruit of the Spirit is clearly evident in my life. Consumerism, by his Spirit at work in our society, has powerfully produced in me his fruit of anxiety. And by this I know that consumerism really is at work in my life. That's my confession today. Now, I don't want to try to prove today that consumerism is a cause of anxiety. It seems to me there is some evidence in the social sciences that point in that direction. For example, nearly 20 years ago, a psychologist by the name of David G. Myers wrote, and I quote, "Compared with their grandparents, today's young adults have grown up with much more affluence, slightly less happiness, and much greater risk of depression and assorted social pathology," end quote. Now, if this was the case nearly 20 years ago when I was a teenager, it seems to me it is even more true today. Nevertheless, I recognize I'm not a social scientist. And the little I've learned about the social sciences have taught me that correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things are related does not mean you can prove one is the cause of another. So don't take this as a kind of proof today, and if you disagree, that's fine. But I want to share a couple reasons why I do think it is at least a major cause, that consumerism is a major cause of anxiety, specifically in my life. As I've thought about it, I've boiled down much of my anxiety to basically two reasons. The first is that consumerism necessarily results in the acquisition of too much debt. Okay, this is a very practical reason. As it is, many people today, probably some of you here, though I don't think we have too many students, but some of you are probably like me, that you're not thinking too critically about the debt you're accumulating in college. And then you get out and it hits you. You're faced with a mountain of debt, and you're starting out in a job already way behind. Now, if this is the only debt you accumulate, you may be okay. If you get a decent job, it might be manageable. But of course, pretty quickly, consumer debt can start creeping in. When I bought my house, for example, the question I asked myself was not, how big of a house do I really need? But how big of a house can I afford? And those two questions are very different. Many of us approach purchases in the same way. Perhaps we could pay for a car with cash, but we could get a much nicer car if we take on monthly payments. Why wait for that piece of furniture, that new appliance, that new TV, the great new phone, when you can take advantage of interest-free payments for a year? The result is that it doesn't take long to find that we are weighed down with debt. Now, if you're careful, if you're frugal and prudent, then maybe the debt you take on will be manageable enough so you don't really notice it. But many of us, I speak for myself, are not that careful. Don't underestimate the amount of anxiety that debt brings with it. Disagreements about money is and has been one of the leading causes that people give for divorce. Amen. Since the 1970s, self-reported financial anxiety has increased among every economic group. During the same time period, consumption has grown exponentially. I'll say that again. Since the 70s, last 40 years, financial anxiety has increased, not just among the poor, among every economic group, and during the same time period, consumption has grown exponentially. Again, while direct causation can be hard to prove, if you're like me, then your own life is a bit of a testimony to the reality of that fact. Now, the second point I want to make is kind of coming at this from the opposite angle. And this, there is some really interesting new psychological research that supports what I'm going to say. I want to talk about thankfulness, about gratitude. Now, I take it as basically self-evident that consumerism works only because it keeps us in a place of discontent. Think about it, right? You only need a few articles of clothing to get through your rough life. If you've seen any of the documentaries on living small, then you know this. They usually will have maybe 5 shirts total and a few pairs of pants, and they live in very small spaces, right? You don't need much to get through life. Yet, most of us have entire wardrobes of clothing. And yet, we're still not content with the clothing we have. We consistently trade out clothing that we perceive to be too worn out, too out of style, or simply that we're sick of for the next new article that we want. We would never do this if we remained content with what we have. But we receive a steady stream of information from advertising that consistently sends the message that we ought not be content with what we have. Right? Treat yourself, as the famous mantra goes. Now, this only works because we are not content. And though contentedness is not the same thing as thankfulness, I think it is pretty obviously closely related, right? Thus, we may be thankful for what we have at the moment, but gratitude tends to wane with our level of contentedness. When we're no longer content, we're usually not thankful for the thing we're not content with. Now, if you take nothing away from today, if I'm starting to lose you, come back in, take this away. I think this is a really interesting point. In recent years, there's been a lot of research done that look at the effects of gratitude on mental health. And it's shown that gratitude greatly improves it. Right? This is not one study. This is a host of studies that all reach the same conclusion. So much so that some have compared practicing gratitude, the effects of practicing gratitude, to the effects of a drug like Lexapro. I mean, if you haven't heard that, think about that. Because a lot of people today are on anti-anxiety and anti-depression drugs. And researchers have started saying the effects we see with practicing gratitude are similar to the effects of a drug that is designed to alter our brain. So, for example, one of these studies, researchers at UC Berkeley conducted a study involving nearly 300 adults. This was a few years back. Most of them were college students seeking mental health counseling. Previously, researchers generally agreed that thankfulness, that there was a shown effect among the healthy population, but it's more recent that they've actually applied this to people who are diagnosed with mental health disorders and who are seeking counseling for that. And so most of these adults were students seeking mental health counseling. Now they separated people into 3 groups, and all of them received mental health counseling during the period of the study. One of the groups was instructed to keep a daily gratitude journal. Gratitude journal is just what it sounds like. It's a journal in which you simply write down the things you're thankful for. Right? It doesn't have to be anything extensive. Now, while the immediate results were negligible, I said like the first week, they didn't see much. By weeks 4 and subsequently by weeks 12, the group that kept the gratitude journal showed significant improvements in mental health over the other 2 groups, even though all of them were receiving mental health counseling. Not only did their perceived mental health improve, but the researchers found that the gratitude letters seemed to even have an effect on the brain. Using an fMRI scanner, the researchers found that those who had been writing the gratitude letters showed greater activation in the medial prefrontal cortex when they expressed gratitude. This part of the brain is associated with learning and decision making, and it would light up even more on the people who are writing these gratitude letters when they express gratitude. Now, while the conclusions are tentative because it's hard to tell exactly why this is the case, the researchers concluded, and I quote, "This finding suggests that practicing gratitude may help the brain to be more sensitive to the experience of gratitude down the line. And this could contribute to improve mental health over time," end quote. Right? So practicing gratitude actually changes your brain to be more attentive to the things that you ought to be thankful for. It's crazy.
Amen.
And this isn't the only study that's shown this. I mean, just Google, right, gratitude and mental health, and you'll see, and I'm not talking about just random news articles, like you'll see published articles that universities have put out. Now, I don't think for us as Christians this should come as a surprise. Not if we've been really immersed in the scriptures and believe what it says. Think back to the words of Paul that we opened with this morning. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Now, if you've been in the church for a while, you may have heard me speak about James Smith. One of my first sermons I ever preached, I basically ripped off a book by James Smith. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little, but he influenced the sermon a lot. He's a Christian philosopher at Calvin College, and he's one of my favorite authors. I think the guy is brilliant and engaging at the same time. Now, something that Smith talks a lot about in his books and lectures is the way that liturgies form us. Right? That word came up in my title. Now, Liturgies are basically, it's kind of this big churchy word, but they're basically cultural practices that we participate in, whether consciously or not, that orient our hearts in a particular direction. They're practices of worship. And Smith argues that, contrary to a lot of thinking in the West, it is not what we think that is most crucial in understanding who we are, but what we love. It's our loves that determine the course of our life and reveal most about who we are. And to the extent that these liturgies, these cultural practices, orient our hearts, they are determinative for what we love and who we worship. Right? They actually make a difference in the kinds of loves we have. Now consider the way I began the sermon today. I talked about a life that's oriented not merely by beliefs or attitudes, but by practices that serve to form my beliefs and attitudes towards consumerism and what constitutes the good life. Practices like checking my phone, shopping as a pastime, purchasing things I don't really need. Now consider this in light of the research I just mentioned. Not only does evidence from UC Berkeley suggest the practice of giving thanks positively affects our mental health, but the practice of thanksgiving, in their words, may help train the brain to be more sensitive to the experience of gratitude down the line, end quote. In other words, gratitude gives birth to more gratitude. In this context, think about some of the Christian practices. Consider the practice of offering thanksgiving to God, whether it's before a meal, or perhaps more specifically in the context of Christian worship together. Consider what we do when we participate in communion and thank God for the sacrifice of Jesus. Consider how we might be changed if we didn't begin each morning checking our social media accounts and focusing upon all the things that we don't have, but rather began our day reading God's Word to learn what He has done for us and praying those truths into our lives. Might such practices reorient us so that the consuming fire that we sense and worship is not that of materialistic consumption, but the consuming fire that is revealed in the Bible, in Jesus Christ. Ward recently said something that I found very profound. He's an open book, so I don't mind sharing it. I think he would say it so. It is the grace of God that he experiences depression when he is not seeking the face of God each day, because it keeps him on his knees. He gets depressed when he's not on his knees every day. Think about that. The grace of God to experience depression. That statement will cause some to recoil. I think it was a profound statement. And I want to suggest this morning that it may be the grace of God that we experience anxiety when we pursue the God of materialism. This is the fruit that the spirit of materialism produces in us. It is not something that Jesus is afflicting you or I with. It is the fruit that comes from practicing the liturgies of a false God. But the fruit of the Spirit, we are told in Galatians, is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I've often heard people scoff at the idea that sometimes is spoken in the Bible that God is jealous. But when you look at God's competition, I think I want to thank God that He's jealous. Thank God that He's not content to let us serve false gods with their attending fruit, like anxiety. Thank God that He desires to have us completely so that the fruits that grow in us are those of His Spirit, peace, joy. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not the only cause of anxiety, so please don't misunderstand that. And I have a certain way of speaking. I come off as a big jerk a lot of the times. It's just my jerk face, right? I'm just born with it. But this really is, these are just things that I've been wrestling with for a few years, and I've already begun to see, well, two things. One, the fruit of them in my life. As I stop chasing after what the world tells me I should be chasing after, but stop and just be still with my kids, right? My kids ask me to play, and usually what that means is they play with toys, and I just sit there and be with them. And they'll tell me exactly what they want me to say and do. It actually doesn't require that much work, right? But as I stop and I'm thankful for just those little times I have, busy myself with other pursuits, I am a lot more at peace. I'm a lot less irritable. I have a lot less anxiety. And then on the flip side, since I become attentive to this, I've also realized how much I am consumed by the God of consumerism. How much my daily routines reflect the liturgies of consumerism. And then I'm surprised when I spend more than I should, or when I'm feeling stressed because my financial situation's a little wacky. Right? You are what you worship. When we participate in the worship and practice of a false God, we will reap the fruit of that God. So I want to close by offering a few steps that I think, right, these aren't like mind-blowing, but I think they're significant. I think the kind of steps that if we practice as a way of life will change us greatly. So the first one you all get special kudos for this morning, because you're here. Right? And everybody else like Ward. No, he's visiting family. And all mornings, people have a really good reason for not being here today. I don't know if I'd be here if I didn't feel like I had to be. I'm glad I am, but I'm just saying the weather was pretty nasty. So the first step is this, right? Participate in public acts of worship. Submit yourself to a church. Nobody's visiting today, but if you're still kind of looking, it certainly doesn't have to be this church. But here's the key. Don't let the shopping mall or your favorite store be your only public place of worship. And I don't mean that to be ironic.
It's true. Amen.
It is a public place of worship. The God of that temple is not the God that is revealed in Jesus Christ. 2, and this closely goes to the first thing, and should be obvious from my sermon. And this is right, this is something that I am not, I can certainly grow it. I'm not that disciplined in, so this is for me as well. Say a prayer of thanksgiving each morning when you rise. Or perhaps even better if time allows, maybe keep a prayer journal. I don't really journal, so I'm not. But if you're the kind of person that journals, just spend a few sentences writing to God what you're thankful for. It doesn't have to be long. Just, God, thank you for this, this, and that. Not only does the Bible tell us of the effects of gratitude, but recent psychological literature is confirming the truth of that. I really think that this might change our lives pretty drastically for the better. Now, as it relates to the third point, so first point, be disciplined in a church, in a community that gathers to worship God, to thank Him, and to practice the practices of Jesus, the practices that will form us towards Him. Point 2, say a prayer of thanksgiving, or you keep a prayer journal or a Thanksgiving journal. Point 3, as it relates to our current season, and this isn't specific, this is more just a general statement. Be careful how you participate in Advent this year. This is something that it's not something that I have flipped gears on overnight, not at all.
Thank you.
But consider how you can participate in this season in ways that orient your heart and the hearts of those around you towards Jesus rather than consumerism. For Amanda and I, for my family, that meant that this year, Amanda and I aren't exchanging gifts at all. And we told our children that we're going to be limiting the gifts a lot more than we have, to 1 or 2. Now, I was shocked when I told them, and we've been kind of slowly doing this for a few years after, like, all right, I got a good job, and it was just like, oh, God, I can finally spoil my kids. And I just bought them a ridiculous amount of junk. To the point now that they have, right, toys that just, they never play with. My daughter will sit in the car, my youngest, she has a very active imagination, and hold her feet up and go, hey, Mommy, and play with her feet, all right? She really doesn't care if she has toys, yet like we have mountains of toys that just sit there most of the time. So for a few years, about a year or two ago, we kind of went, wait a second, what are we doing? So when I really started realizing the way that I was complicit in serving this false god. And so we've been cutting back. And so this year I go to my kids and we tell them, like, we're going to do maybe 1 or 2 gifts. I want you to really think about what you actually want. Like, how about not just another Barbie to add to your collection of 50 Barbies? I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. But here's what shocked me. My kids were totally cool with it. Completely cool. And I give a lot of the credit to my wife because kind of the theme of gratitude has been the theme in children's church for the past few weeks. And at home, she's been talking to them about things that relate to it. I have one of my daughter's best friends right now is in the Philippines because her parents are medical missionaries and they're living in a very small home and they have a woman who comes over and collects from their trash every day. And my daughter is hearing about this and she's realizing, whoa, I don't need that much. And she's 8. So thank God that she's way further ahead than I am. Right?
Yeah.
I still believe I need as much as I have. And she's figuring it out. So when we told them, they were totally cool with it. And part of the way that we've helped them come along is, that Mike mentioned the church has adopted a couple families through the Salvation Army. Right? So last week we took them out and we went shopping for some of the kids. And we told them, partly because, right, that they're not receiving so many gifts this year, that they're able to go buy these for other kids who may not get any gifts, right? They live in our backyard, and they may not get any, if people weren't willing to do something like this. And it totally changed their perspective. They're super excited about buying these toys for other kids. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that anybody has to do what Amanda and I are doing. Maybe some of you are further ahead, and maybe some of you are just beginning to think about this, right? I'm just sharing kind of the ways that we've begun to incorporate